We're going to explore 6 of Mathew Franklin Whittier's New Year's essays or stories, New Year's pieces. And this may not sound too exciting, but there's some pretty interesting implications. We're going to cross-reference them, and you'll see how they relate to some more important issues. Let's see here. We're going to start with a pseudonym that Mathew is definitely known to have written, and I say that because the pseudonym is Poins, P-O-I-N-S, a Shakespearean character, and we know that that's 100% definitely Mathew's signature because his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, mentions one of that series in a letter in correspondence and says that it's Mathew's. So all of the 14 pieces in the Portland transcript in the early 1840s signed Poins are Mathew Franklin Whittier's. Now, I've written a paper about this, and I've had 2 rejections so far, and it's submitted to a 3rd journal. And I mean, this is facts. It's all facts, and it's a serious discovery. And yet, because my paper, they call it an essay, quote unquote, because it doesn't sound scholarly, and I don't cite a whole bunch of other scholars, but there's no other scholars to cite because I'm the pioneer. You know, once again, I'm the person that discovered this, and there's some major implications. But anyway, we'll see if somebody is farsighted enough, some editor is farsighted enough and courageous enough to print it, even though it doesn't look scholarly. Anyway, this is the Portland transcript of 1841 to 1843. Here's the volume. And we're going to look at a Poins signed New Year's essay. And it's in the, this is a weekly, so this is in the December 31, 1842 edition. Now what I'm going to do is read the opening of each one, and then I'm going to dip down and kind of read a sample. But I'm going to provide a link to a written blog, and what we're going to do is to combine the video blog with the written blog. So because I really can't give all the evidence here, I'm going to link in the written blog to each one of these pieces, photographic copies of each one of these pieces, and you can look at the primary sources for yourself, and you can compare them for yourself. So let's take a look at this here. This is called The New Year, and he opens up with a quote. This is a quote from Edward Young. His book of poetry, Night Thoughts, was published in 1798, and the quote reads, "The bell strikes 1. We take no note of time, but from its loss, to give it then a tongue is wise in man." So that's quoted Young. And then I'm just going to open it up here. "Another is added to the long catalogue of buried years, gone like its predecessors, scored with the bright and dark records of human virtues and human vices. Those records are indelible and may not be erased or changed. No regrets can recall what we may now feel to be misused time. Its course is ever forward to the goal of eternity. God grant that in the year just past, the lighter may predominate over the darker shades in its register of our actions." So this is Poins. This is definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier. What he goes on to talk about the Millerites, which is a doomsday sect that says the end is at hand, like the guy with the, sandwich sign walking up and down the sidewalk. So he talks about them. It's clear that he's a Christian. It's clear that he's devotional, that Mathew is, but, he's not convinced that the Millerites are correct about the end of the world. Let me go down into this a little bit. This is near the end. "Religion can alone prepare us for death or for the coming of Christ, and anyone who will may be clothed with this panoply of might. True religion is simple. It is all contained in this brief passage. Visit the widow and the fatherless in their affliction, and keep thyself unspotted from the world," quote unquote. By the last clause, we are to keep ourselves free from the vices of the world, and God, if we ask him, will for Christ's sake enable us to do it. And by the first, we are commanded to do all in our power to alleviate the sufferings of our fellow creatures. So that gives you an idea of who Mathew Franklin Whittier is and how he writes. Now, there were earlier instances. I just wanted to start with the one that we 100% know is Matthew to kind of set the tone there. So now let's go back to January 1, 1831. Matthew, as a boy of 12, started writing and publishing in 1825. And by the way, this is not that unusual in that era. He was a child prodigy, but he wasn't the only one. I ran across an example in the transcript here where there's a story by a 13-year-old girl, and it's a pretty competent little story, So there were, young teens that were, publishing in some of these periodicals and so on. So anyway, here we have the Constellation. This was owned and edited by a man named Asa Green. This was his second newspaper. His first one had been in Plainfield, Massachusetts. The Berkshire American. Matthew had contributed to that one also as a boy. So now he's gone up to New York City and he's writing for the Constellation. But by this time, he's editing it. Mathew Franklin Whittier is the editor. And this is something scholars have missed completely because they simply didn't know Matthew was, simply invisible to them. So they assumed all this material is written by Asa Green, the owner, and they assumed that Asa Green is a humorist and so on. Well, no, Asa Green was not a humorist. It was Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was editing the paper, who was the humorist. His go-to signature in this paper was D. I think it stood for Diogenes, possibly for a printer's devil. It's hard to say. But anyway, on the second page, we have something called the City Hall Clock. Well, this is a humorous way of introducing the idea of time for the New Year's edition. Apparently, the City Hall clock was taking a long time to be completed, and the mechanism wasn't, operating and so on. And so Matthew kind of teased the city about the fact that the City Hall clock was still sitting there, suspended in time. So we'll open it up and then we'll read a little bit down toward the bottom. I did want to mention if and when you get into the page, the photographed page for this, right before it is a piece that's unsigned, also by Mathew Franklin Whittier. I'm going to say 100% sure myself by style. It's called The Ghost of the Cellar. And it has several Black people kind of, being silly about superstitions. Well, and it's written in Black dialect and so on. And what I've said was that Matthew, in his youth, because we're talking 19 years old, or actually 18 years old at this point, when he was 18, he wasn't quite so careful about, about what we would call racism today, about stereotyping. And so this would be viewed today as a racist piece. To him, he made fun of all ethnic groups, Irishmen, Frenchmen, Yankees, of which he was one, and sailors, he loved to imitate dialects and poke lighthearted fun at all these different groups. Well, it was the same with Blacks, and it wasn't really mean-spirited. It was kind of naive of him. Later on, he stopped doing that. And the reason this is significant is that when Francis A. Durivage and George P. Burnham tricked Matthew out of his entire unpublished portfolio and published the entire portfolio, that portfolio went back to this period, 1831. And they picked up and published some of those early racist pieces, which Matthew would never have done in 1848 when they tricked him out of his portfolio. So it's proof positive that Matthew did not give that to them willingly, and that they did, in fact, steal his portfolio and published things from it that he never would have published in 1848. So in a way, it's kind of fortunate for us that they did that. Anyway, if you get in there and you see this racist piece called The Ghost of the Cellar with these Black people being very superstitious and speaking in dialect, you'll know that that's Matthew at an early age. So now we're going to move to the City Hall clock. I'm going to open it up. Some 2 or 3 years since, a vote was passed by the City Corporation authorizing a clock to be placed in the cupola of the City Hall. The work was not commenced, however, till sometime last spring, when the cupola was decapitated to make room for the clock. In doing this, the wooden image of Justice, which for so long a time, through every change of wind and parties, had kept her balance, was lowered from her pride of place to be repainted and brushed up. This being about the time the revised statutes went into operation, was by many thought to be an act of justice in order to remodel and adapt her antiquated form and apparel to the new system of things. So he's making a metaphor, that the clock is a metaphor for the political situation in New York City and so forth and so on. So down toward the bottom here, the last paragraph, we are not yet unenlightened with the new gaslight City Hall clock. The cavities in the cupola have been closed up with boards, like the upper windows of a 3-story Yankee farmhouse. What is going on inside, no man can conjecture. Whether time is at work there, greasing his wheels, so that when he starts the City Hall clock, he may move more swiftly, or what is the cause of the delay is still a mystery. Some say that the times are out of joint, that the revolution in France has put a new face upon things, and that the City Hall clock is to commence its revolutions on a new principle. Others, more wise, hold that the old-fashioned ways are still to be observed, but that some of the machinery of the City Hall clock is to be moved by steam. There is no getting at the truth. Time, says the old proverb, reveals all things. We hope he will soon show us the City Hall clock, and it's signed D. That's Matthew's go-to signature again in this paper. So it's a wry, metaphorical commentary on the City Hall clock and time and current events. Typical of Matthew, he's a philosopher and a humorist. So when you see philosophical humor, and it's one of the pseudonyms that I've associated with Matthew, it's a pretty good sign that that's probably him. Now we're going to turn to roughly the same era, but published much later in 1853. This is called Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. It was published by Francis Durivage, one of the two men that swindled Matthew out of his portfolio. And some of the pieces in this go back to this same era. Now in the very back, I've already shared this very recently, is the New Year's Bells. The New Year's Bells is the next to last piece. This is where the Old Year and the New Year starts. The Old Year and the New Year is the very last one. It's been modified in the text to 1853. This piece was written not in 1853, but by Matthew in 1831. And I can tell by style, definitely, because Matthew used a kind of a science fiction-ish, humorous style. Back when he was 18, 19, 20, that was his style. So that's what this is. And I'll start it out and I'll go dip into it a little bit. It's very short. But the point is that if this was written, which it obviously was, back in Matthew's science fiction-ish time in like 1830, 1831, then the New Year's Bells, which precedes it, was also written about that same time. And if the New Year's Bells was written in 1830 or 1831, it precedes the publication of A Christmas Carol by about 13 years. And that's important because the New Year's Bells is really a template for A Christmas Carol. It's that close. It's what Matthew and Abby used as a starting point when they wrote A Christmas Carol before Dickens ever got his hands on it. So, it's significant in that sense. All right, the old year and the new. Oh, this is beautiful, beautiful indeed, cried a young and silvery voice, musical as fairy bells heard at midnight. How white the snowy drapery hangs upon the roofs of these bright palaces. And the speaker, a gay boy, danced trippingly along, following in the footsteps of an old gray-bearded man who was tottering before him. The old man turned. You call that snowy drapery beautiful, said he. Yes, it is like the raiment of a bride, said the boy. To me, it seems a shroud thrown over the grave of buried hopes, answered the old man. So it's the new year and the old year, And again, this was typical of Matthew, especially during that early period. It's another metaphorical, piece. It's not so much humorous, but it's metaphorical. Now we'll get down to the bottom. Away with these croaking reminiscences, cried the younger voice. Let the music peal. Let the dance go on. The wine is red within the cup. Yes, and the deadly serpent lurks below. Then the world is all desolate, cried the New Year. No, there are green spots in the desert, said the Old Year, but beware of deeming it all fairyland. But a little while, and you will follow me. But the end is not here. After time, eternity. There suffering and sin are unknown. There each departed spirit, after making the circuit of its appointed sphere, shall rise to a higher and a higher, while boundless love and wisdom illuminate all, radiating from a center whose brightness no human senses can conceive. The old man was gone. The joyous bells had rung his requiem. The young heir was enthroned, and with mingled hope and foreboding commenced the reign of 1853. It was not originally 1853. It was probably 1831. But you get a sense again of Matthew's writing, his use of metaphor, his philosophy. And of course, he was a Christian. He did not accept reincarnation at this point. If he ever accepted it, it wasn't until at least 1850 when I think he wrote a little unsigned piece about pre-existence and talked about the experience of remembering things that happened before you were born, which apparently he had had and other people had had. So he started to be open to it around 1850, as I believe, but definitely not before. He was an esoteric Christian, but nonetheless, like the spiritualists, some of them today, believe in an eternity after one lifetime. So that's about 1830 or 1831, stolen and published in 1853 by someone else. Now let's look at one that's signed with Matthew's star. Now I can't easily prove that Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote with an asterisk or star, but I can prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. Cumulative evidence would take me 3 or 4 days to prove it to anybody, and not in a video. It would have to be in person. They'd have to come and sit down with me for a week. And over a week's time, I would show them maybe 100 different pieces and convince them that indeed Matthew was writing as the star from as early as 1829 and as late as 1873. This is significant because Margaret Fuller claimed Matthew's work in 1844 through 1846 in the New York Tribune. She claimed that as hers. It was signed with a star. That was not her. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier. And then when she went to Europe, she continued to use it, but so did Matthew. He continued to use it in other papers. I mean, he wasn't going to stop using his own pseudonym just because Margaret Fuller appropriated it, see? So this is signed with a star, and it is in I think it's the December 1832 edition of the New England Magazine. This is a bound copy of it. I think I've got that date right. So here we have The Course of Time, an Allegory. And once again, this is a New Year's piece. It's science fiction, basically philosophical science fiction. And the premise of the thing is that the narrator has had a dream. And in his dream, he sees the year, the new year, or the old year, I can't remember which one. He sees the year coming at him like a group of people, a whole assemblage of people and all different types and shapes and sizes, and some on horses and some not on horses, some in wagons and so forth and so on. And I guess it's the old year, 1832. So it comes and he describes everybody, as a huge metaphor, and then it all disappears, and then he wakes up, see? So here we have The Course of Time, an allegory, and he says it's an allegory, but again, most of Matthew's work is metaphorical in one way or another. I had been drinking champagne. My sleep was uneasy. I began to dream. Methought I was awakened out of a quiet and profound slumber by a loud rumbling, as if of heavy wagons driven furiously along a paved road, mixed with a brisk rattle as of light carriages, joined with a clattering of hoofs and a trampling of feet, intermingled now and then with sounds somewhat more definite, as of trumpets bellowing, fiddles screeching, men shouting, women crying, drums, bassoons, Jews' harps, clarionets, and hand organs. This odd combination of sounds seemed at first to strike upon my ear as if from a great distance, but, growing louder and louder, it soon roused me from my slumbers. I sprang upon my feet and began to look about me. Methought it was broad daylight, and as I looked around, I perceived that I had been sleeping by the side of a dusty, wide, well-traveled highway, leading to, I knew not what, great metropolis. This road was roughly paved with stones of all dimensions. Its surface was very uneven, and it was full of holes and ruts innumerable. I found myself standing at the foot of a high pillar, or rather obelisk, which was placed close by the roadside and towered far above my head, serving, as I conjectured, among other purposes, as a landmark or milestone. At any rate, it had emblazoned upon it, in large golden letters, all caps, 1832, which, from some reason or other, but what I can scarcely tell, seemed to me to contain some reference to the length of the road. See, so of course he's announcing the old year passing by. And it's quite fantastical and goes on and about the way that everybody's desperately trying to survive at the expense of other people and so forth and so on. So here's the last paragraph. I stood a long time in reverential silence and wrapped in meditation. At length, I turned to pursue my investigations, but I had passed onward only a short distance when I perceived that the light of day had faded into a twilight, which was itself rapidly diminishing. The noise of time's cavalcade was fast dying away in the distance, and had sunk already into a low moaning, like the sound of waves on some far distant beach. All the objects around me had begun to assume a hazy and indistinct appearance. The piles of treasure and heaps of dead bodies seemed silently to sink and crumble into dust. A feeling of strange awe came over me. The whole mass of ruins with which the road had been loaded sunk imperceptibly and disappeared. I looked toward the old man and his pile of volumes. He was still distinctly visible, though all about him had vanished and left bare the rugged pavements of the road. But while I was still looking, he too began to share the common fate. His pile of volumes wasted noiselessly away. His figure and features grew indistinct, dissolved into air, and disappeared. Even the tall obelisk on which I had first taken my station began to fade from my sight. All was still and silent as the grave. The feeling of vacant loneliness was dreadful. I sunk insensible to the earth. I awoke. It was a dream. And there is the star, the asterisk, you see. So that is also Mathew Franklin Whittier, sounding exactly like he had in the other sources. So this brings up a point. When I say that I spent 12 years rigorously tracking down and verifying Mathew's authorship of a great many pseudonyms and a great many pieces, I'm not just fooling around with this. I really was extremely rigorous because I didn't want to be wrong, for one thing, So that's also Mathew. And you'll note that, this is the end of 1832. I don't remember the timeline or chronology of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, but this is before the science fictionist stories that Poe supposedly wrote, some of which I think were actually plagiarized from Mathew or from other people. But, Poe was a phony. He was an imposter. This is the real deal. This was actually the real guy who was writing science fiction in 1831. I think at this point we have to go to Mathew's work for the New York Tribune. Again, this is from the fall of 1844 until maybe the fall of 1846 or mid-1846. A few of the very last ones, I think, were written by Margaret Fuller. I don't have a physical copy of this first one. This is for New Year's 1845, but I do have a microfilm copy that I'll put up on the screen for you. I will be using this book, which is really the height of irony. This is called Margaret Fuller, Critic, Writings from the New York Tribune, 1844 to 1846. It was edited by and written by Judith Matson Bean and Joel Meyerson. I think Judith Matson Bean was really the primary author, and Joel Meyerson was kind of brought in for a little more academic weight, I gather. They have a long preface here, but they have reproduced a great many of these star-signed essays in the New York Tribune, thinking that they were by Margaret Fuller, and all the commentary assumes that these things were written by Margaret Fuller. And while they don't have all of them in the text, they have a CD in the back of PDFs of all of them, which I was able to rip, thankfully. And here we have New Year's Day. So this appears in the, I think it's the 1st of January, 1845. But I'll put the microfilm copy up on the screen. It was a beautiful custom among some of the Indian tribes once a year to extinguish all the fires and, by a day of fasting and profound devotion, to propitiate the Great Spirit for the coming year. They then produced sparks by friction and lit up afresh the altar and the hearth with the new fire. And this was considered as the most precious and sacred gift from one person to another, binding them in bonds of inviolate friendship for that year, certainly, with a hope that the same might endure through life. From the young to the old, it was a token of the highest respect. From the old to the young, of a great expectation. Now, I wrote a written blog entry recently, and yesterday I think it was, and the gist of it was that I pointed out that it makes a huge difference in your subjective experience of reading a piece who you think the author was, who you think is writing to you, because you bring to that everything you know about that author, and you imagine, whether you want to or not, subconsciously, you imagine that particular author with everything you know about them writing to you, and you create a world, basically. But in this case, it's a mistake because it's not Margaret Fuller speaking to you. It's Mathew Franklin Whittier speaking to you, the same person as wrote these other pieces that I just shared with you, see? So this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's respect for the Indian culture, not Margaret Fuller's. And Mathew was actually quite ambivalent about Native Americans because he'd been raised with stories of how they massacred people in Massachusetts, in his hometown area of Haverhill. See, so, you know, his culture said that Indians were savages, and his mother and his upbringing said that they were savages. And yet he always tried to give the underdog a chance and always tried to look for the noble in any group, see, despite the fact that he made kind of lighthearted fun of ethnic groups at the same time. So what we just heard was Mathew. Now, let's see. This is a whole bunch of material. This is where I would suggest that you go in and actually read this, and read it with the understanding that it was written by the man whose work I just shared with you, you know, not by Margaret Fuller. Try to get Margaret Fuller out of your mind as the great transcendentalist, and imagine that Mathew, who was a real philosopher, as opposed to kind of a pretend philosopher, is speaking to you. Now, let's just pick this up kind of arbitrarily halfway in. Can he sleep who in this past year has wickedly or lightly committed acts calculated to injure the few or many, who has poisoned the ears and the hearts he might have rightly informed, who has steeped in tears the cup of thousands, who has put back, as far as in him lay, the accomplishment of general good and happiness for the sake of his selfish aggrandizement or selfish luxury, who has sold to a party what is meant for mankind, if such sleep dreadful shall be the waking. Deliver us from evil. In public or in private, it is easy to give pain, hard to give pure pleasure, easy to do evil, hard to do good. God does his good in the whole, despite of bad men, but only from a very pure mind will he permit original good to proceed in the day. Happy those who can feel that during the past year they have, to the best of their knowledge, refrained from evil. Happy those who determine to proceed in this by the light of conscience. It is but a spark, yet from that spark may be drawn firelight enough for worlds and systems of worlds, and that light is ever new. Now, Mathew was a deeply committed Christian, and again, albeit he was an esoteric Christian. He became a Swedenborgian and so on, but he was a Christian. And he had a very keen sense of social justice, had a very keen sense of compassion for the underdog and the oppressed and underprivileged. And pardon me, I haven't killed my fruit flies like most people normally would do in Maine. So here I am, you know, before New Year's, and I've still got the things flying around in my apartment because at this point I don't want to kill them. So I don't know. I haven't named them yet. If I name them, that's it. So here's the deal. This is very unlikely for Margaret Fuller because Margaret Fuller was very intellectual and kind of self-consciously progressive and a feminist, but she really wasn't a Christian. She really wasn't devotional. I mean, she kind of makes a show of it, you know, kind of hems and haws about her Christianity in certain places and so on. But this is somebody who's deeply committed, see, who's fervent, and not in a Bible thumping way, but he's fervent in applying his Christianity, see. Margaret Fuller was not. So it's a bad fit for Margaret Fuller if you really look carefully at the thing. And it's an excellent fit for Mathew Franklin Whittier. Now, I do happen to have a physical copy of the New Year's star-signed piece in the New York Tribune for 1846. It so happens I have the January 3rd edition of the weekly. It appeared in the January 1st edition of the daily. But here is the weekly edition, and January 3rd. And I'm going to get that out here, and we'll look at that. Now, you've seen, I showed you on the screen, or will have shown you on the screen, the asterisk that accompanied that last article. This is no different. This is signed with a big fat asterisk, and it's the same person, the same asterisk that appeared in the 1832 New England magazine. Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote both of these, okay? You know, and I can't share with you all the research that went behind this, but what you have is the power of a myth, and a myth that dozens and dozens and dozens of scholars have bought into and been fooled by, against good, solid research done by myself, you know, which is presented not in scholarly mumbo jumbo, but in a straightforward manner. See, it's not considered, it's considered an essay. The thing is, as I told one of these editors, the last one that I submitted this paper to, an essay is a put down, a pejorative, you know. It means this is an editorial. That's what they mean when they say it's an essay. And they'll pretend to be nice that we really enjoyed your essay, you know, if they read it. But an essay is not a paper. It's not scholarly, see. But these aren't essays in the sense of editorials. This is evidence from primary sources. And there's nobody to cite because nobody's ever figured this out before, you know. And there's no need for me to use academic jargon because I'm not an academician. I'm not affiliated with academia. So why should I put on airs and try to speak in that lingo, see? It's like, let's suppose that you figured out some amazing new discovery, invention concerning plumbing, and you go to a plumbing convention. Well, every convention and every type of profession has got their own shop talk. And you walk up there and you speak in ordinary language and say, I've developed this invention for plumbing that's going to revolutionize toilets or drains or whatever it is, you know. But because you're not speaking shop talk, they won't pay any attention to you. Even though the invention is legitimate and you could actually show it to them if you could get them to pay attention for longer than 5 seconds. So that's kind of the situation I'm in. That's my little editorial. That was an editorial. So now we have January 1st, 1846 is the title. The new year dawns, and its appearance is hailed by a flutter of festivity. Men and women run from house to house, scattering gifts, smiles, and congratulations. It is a custom that seems borrowed from a better day, unless indeed it be a prophecy that such must come. For why so much congratulation? A year has passed. We are nearer by a 12th month to the term of this earthly probation. It is a solemn thought, and though the consciousness of having hallowed the days by our best endeavor, and of having much occasion to look at the ruling power of all with grateful benediction, must, in cases where such feelings are unalloyed, bring joy, one would think it must even then be a grave joy, and one that would disincline to this loud gaiety in welcoming a new year, another year, in which we may indeed strive forward in a good spirit, and find our strivings blessed, but must surely expect trials, temptations, and disappointments from without, frailty, shortcoming, or convulsion in ourselves. So this is Matthew the philosopher. This is not Margaret Fuller, the Transcendentalist. Again, I urge you to go and read this for yourself, but I will just dip down here toward the end. Another sign of the times is that there are left on the earth none of the last dynasty of geniuses, rich in so many imperial heads. The world is full of talent, but it flows downward to water the plain. There are no towering heights, no Mont Blanca now. We cannot recall one great genius at this day living. The time of prophets is over, and the era they prophesied must be at hand. In its conduct, a larger proportion of the human race shall take part than ever before. As prime ministers have succeeded kings in the substantials of monarchy, so now shall a House of Representatives succeed prime ministers. Altogether, it looks as if a great time was coming, and that time one of democracy. Our country will play a ruling part. Her eagle will lead the van, but whether to soar upward to the sun or to stoop for helpless prey, who now dares promise? At present, she has scarce achieved a Roman nobleness, a Roman liberty, and whether her eagle is less like the vulture and more like the phoenix than was the fierce Roman bird, we dare not say. May the new year give hopes of the latter, even if the bird need first to be purified by fire. Well, this is pretty relevant for today, is it not? Because this is very radical stuff, because what he's saying is that he fears that America, having achieved freedom, is going to end up being more like Rome, imperialistic, than like a phoenix. See, this is extremely radical stuff. Now, whether you want to say that Margaret Fuller was like that or not, we have far more evidence that this was Mathew Franklin Whittier. He was, in later years, connected with William Lloyd Garrison, whose motto was no union with slaveholders, really radical. So Mathew was really radical. And I think Margaret Fuller was not so much radical except with regard to feminism, see? So all of this is a huge mistake, That asterisk, that was never Margaret Fuller. She was the literary editor, but she wasn't writing this material. She would stick her thumb in it occasionally, especially when she really admired somebody that Mathew didn't, in a review. She would stick her thumb in it, or possibly on occasion write the whole thing, and override Mathew. But generally speaking, these things that people are so impressed with, thinking that they're Margaret Fuller, that's Mathew. That's not her. So that's the little tiny bit I wanted to show you. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. I got quite a bit of editing to do because that wasn't so easy to present, and I'm afraid I still made a hash of it. But as far as the new year goes, I mean, we're in every bit as hot water, if not more, than we were when Mathew wrote. Mathew could see these things coming. He saw the source of it, and he could see it playing out. And he warned against the Mexican-American War. He warned against slavery, and quite a number of other social ills and mistakes that were being made. He was patriotic in his way, but he wasn't real optimistic. Now, I'm going to share something that happened to me a long time ago, and that was that I had a dream. And I think we're talking 20 or even 30 years ago, but at least 20, probably 30 years ago. And in this dream, it's nighttime or evening, and there's long lines of people just standing, and they're waiting to get on huge transport planes, and they're Chinese planes. But we're in America, and these are Chinese planes, and the people in line are shaking their heads. They're stunned, and they're saying, "I can't believe the United States is over." It was so vivid, I can still remember it to this day, 30 years later. And beyond that, I can't say, but I'll put it on record.